Hey everyone, welcome back. I feel like keeping up with what's happening in the world can be a full-time job, especially with everything going on with the war in Ukraine. There's so much information coming out. It's hard to even know where to start sometimes, right?
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming.
So we're going to take a deep dive today into some recent press reports that are suggesting things might be heading in a new direction, a surprising new direction.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
It's easy to just get kind of sucked into those day-to-day headlines, but we want to kind of like zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
yeah, exactly. So according to press reports, it seems like the U.S. might be shifting its stance on the war, possibly pushing for some kind of negotiated peace deal with Russia. And that has not been met with, total agreement in Europe. There's been some serious pushback from leaders who think that ending the war without a clear victory for Ukraine is just not an option.
Right.
So,
And this really highlights, I think, the uncertainty of the whole situation. You've got some experts who are saying that Russia is on the verge of collapse, that they've been weakened by the battlefield losses and the economic sanctions, and that, continuing to support Ukraine will eventually just lead to Russia's defeat.
right. So one side of the coin is saying Russia's weak, they're about to fall apart. But then there's another side.
Yeah, the other side of the coin is saying that actually Russia might be getting stronger, and that Europe, without the full backing of the U.S., is not really ready to handle a longer military confrontation with Russia.
So we have two very different interpretations of the same situation. And it's not just, an academic debate. This has real consequences, and the stakes are incredibly high. Which leads us to the question of, where does Europe go from here? Is a peaceful resolution at all possible? And if so, what would that even look like?
Yeah, those are the big questions. I mean, we can't ignore the human cost of this war, the suffering, the desire for justice. But we also have to balance that with, with a realistic assessment of the situation on the ground. And according to press reports, let's look at this argument about continuing the war and the idea that Russia's about to fall apart. Because, some reports point to, their struggles, especially on the economic front. But then we also see reports about, recent advances they've made militarily. For example, their offensive in the Donbass region. That was successful. That suggests they're not, backing down at all.
So pinning all our hopes on Russia just collapsing might be a bit of a gamble.
Yeah, you could say that. And then there's the whole narrative about Russia, being driven by this desire to just expand their borders. Like they have this insatiable thirst for empire. And according to press reports, is that really what's motivating them? Or is that more of a Western way of looking at things? Are we projecting our own ideas onto them?
So it's not as simple as just saying Russia's the aggressor, therefore they have to be stopped no matter what.
Right.
We have to really look deeper into this and question those assumptions.
Exactly. And, according to press reports, we need to be honest about the potential consequences of continuing down this road of war. It's a very risky path, not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. A longer conflict could really destabilize the whole region. It could turn Ukraine into a failed state. And who's going to end up bearing the brunt of that? It'll be Europe, both financially and in terms of security risks.
Right. So if the path of war is so dangerous, what about the alternative? What about trying to negotiate peace? Is that even a realistic option at this point?
Well, it's definitely a complex one.
Yeah.
But according to press reports, if we want to explore the possibility of a negotiated settlement, the first thing we have to do is get everybody to the table, including Russia. And everybody has to be willing to compromise. We have to understand the security concerns of every nation involved, even if we don't agree with their point of view.
That sounds like a very difficult thing to do given the level of distrust and animosity that exists right now.
Yeah, for sure. But according to press reports, the potential benefits are huge. We're talking about the possibility of rebuilding Ukraine, of integrating it into the EU, and ultimately creating a more stable and prosperous future for the whole region.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our listeners for a second. What does all of this mean for you? How can you make sense of all of this and stay informed as the situation develops?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is you have to be willing to look at everything with a critical eye. This is a complicated situation, and there are always going to be multiple perspectives to consider. So don't just accept the first narrative you come across. Really dig into it, explore different sources, and be open to challenging your own assumptions.
Yeah, it's easy to just kind of fall into that trap of confirmation bias, where you're just looking for information that confirms what you already believe. But in a situation like this that's changing so rapidly, it's really important to stay open to new information.
Absolutely. And remember, what we're talking about today is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. This situation is constantly evolving and things can change very quickly.
So we need to be flexible and adapt as new information comes out. Going back to the idea of peace negotiations, I imagine some people might see that as like giving in to Russia or even betraying Ukraine.
Yeah, I can understand that perspective. It comes from a place of concern. But according to press reports, we have to remember that pursuing peace doesn't mean we're condoning Russia's actions. It's about recognizing the reality of the situation and trying to find a way to prevent more suffering and potentially an even bigger catastrophe down the road.
So instead of viewing negotiations as surrender, maybe it's more helpful to think of them as a strategic decision,
Right.
a difficult one, but one that could lead to a more stable future.
Exactly. And according to press reports, there's another potential benefit. A negotiated settlement could give us a framework for addressing some of the root causes of the conflict. Things like, Ukraine's neutrality security guarantees for all sides, and maybe even mechanisms for resolving future disputes peacefully.
I mean, that sounds very ambitious, almost idealistic. But history has shown us that even the most entrenched conflicts can be resolved through dialogue.
That's right. The Cold War is a good example. That was a time of incredible tension and mistrust. But in the end, diplomacy prevailed, and it prevented what could have been a global disaster.
Right. That was a time when it felt like the world was on the brink of nuclear war. But cooler heads prevailed, and they found a way to de-escalate the situation. Obviously, the current situation is different, and we can't just draw direct comparisons. But the point is, we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of diplomacy, even when it seems like a long shot.
I agree. According to press reports, the alternative, which is a prolonged war with all of its unpredictable consequences, that's just too dangerous to even contemplate.
It seems like the risks of continuing the conflict are just too great. Which brings us back to a fundamental question. If we all agree that peace is the goal, what sacrifices are we willing to make as individuals and as a global community to actually achieve it?
That's a big question. It's one that requires us to look deep inside ourselves. Are we willing to compromise? Are we willing to question our own beliefs? And are we willing to accept that peace might not look the way we imagined it or happen on the terms we prefer?
Yeah, those are tough questions to ask, but they're important ones if we're serious about building a more peaceful world. And as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, it's important to remember that this is just a snapshot of a very complex situation.
Right.
Things are constantly changing. New information is coming out all the time. So, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, keep thinking critically. Now, before we go, I want to leave you with this thought. History is full of surprises, and we rarely know what the future holds.
That's true.
So let's try to stay open to the possibility of unexpected outcomes. Who knows? Maybe a year from now, we'll look back and be amazed at how much things have changed.
The only thing we know for sure is that things will change, and we need to be ready to adapt our thinking as they do.
Well said. That brings us to the end of this part of our deep dive. I hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, seek out different perspectives, and engage in thoughtful discussions.
Exactly. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. We've only just scratched the surface of this complex issue.
There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more nuances to unpack.
And that's what's so fascinating about it. For all of you listening out there, the journey of understanding doesn't stop when the podcast ends. It's about taking these ideas, these different viewpoints, and continuing to engage with them. Talk to your friends, do your own research, and most importantly, don't be afraid to question what you hear and read.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is more important than ever. We're bombarded with information from all sides, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed or even manipulated. But if you develop those critical thinking skills, you can cut through all the noise and reach your own conclusions.
Well said. And remember, there's no one right answer when it comes to these complex global issues. It's about understanding the different perspectives, the historical context, the potential consequences of different actions.
It's about recognizing the human element, the lives that are affected, the choices that are made, the hopes and fears that drive those choices.
Exactly. And as we try to navigate these uncertain times, let's remember the power of empathy, the importance of dialogue, and the possibility of finding common ground even when it seems like there's no hope.
It's a worthwhile goal.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one sharing your insights with us and challenging our perspectives.
We'd love that. Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.